Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here. This is a very exciting event for me and for everyone in the chaplaincy. Thank you to our panelists for being here. I'm really excited for the conversation tonight. Before I kind of introduce the Humanist Chaplaincy here and myself, and we begin our panel, I want to do a short reading. We often do readings before events and at small group reflections of humanist authors or authors who express kind of a humanist perspective. And can maybe not necessarily speak specifically to the themes of the night, but can get us in a frame of mind that I think is relevant. So I want to share a reading from someone you may know named Alice Walker, who is a poet, best known as the author of The Color Purple. She identifies as a humanist, and she has a poem called When You See Water. And I quite like it, and I think it might just get us in a place of mind that might be helpful as we begin. So Alice Walker writes, "When you see water in a stream, you say, 'Oh, this is a stream.' Water. When you see water in the river, you say, 'Oh, this is water of the river.' When you see the ocean water, you say, 'This is the ocean's water.' But actually, water is always only itself and does not belong to any of these containers, though it creates them, and so it is with you." So that's by Alice Walker. So if you don't know me, I think I tried to meet everyone here, and thank you all again for being here. But my name is Walker. I'm the humanist in residence here. I'm one of the university chaplains. I work on the chaplaincy staff, which is an interreligious staff here in the university chaplaincy. It's a really, I think, vibrant part of campus life here at Tufts. We work a lot directly with students, and we also work a lot with the administration. So I think we serve a really important role here on campus, and I'm really proud to be a part of this. And I have some of my colleagues, Zach and Lynn and Greg, here tonight, and I'm really happy y'all can make it. My program, the Tufts Humanist Chaplaincy, is a new program we started last year after a lot of organizing by students and other staff and administrators to both give a voice to people who are not necessarily traditionally religious or humanist or atheist or agnostic in the existing Tufts chaplaincy framework, and to make these resources more accessible to people with that background and just expand the reach that the Tufts chaplaincy has to work with people across, a general spiritual spectrum on campus. And Tufts has a tremendous amount of spiritual diversity, and over the last few years with Greg's work and everyone else in the chaplaincy staff's work, rethinking how we think of chaplaincy and what kind of programs we support and what communities we're a part of on campus. I think we've really started to expand that vision, and I'm really proud to be a part of that. The Tufts Humanist Chaplaincy specifically, we do regular small group reflection meetings that some of y'all have attended, which I'm really happy to see y'all here. We do regular, a lot of one-on-one work. I work with students. We've done some programs at the Tufts Veterinary School as a part of the chaplaincy at large. And we've really just tried to be a part of this chaplaincy collaborative team that is expanding our vision of what chaplaincy means. And so that's kind of the topic tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about how people working in a lot of different settings, including university and also prison and hospice and hospital chaplaincy, are engaging this growing kind of changing religious landscape that we're only now beginning to really understand in different ways in America, where a quickly growing number of people don't really identify with a particular religious tradition, or at least identify with religion in the way that it's always historically been understood, kind of are using their own spiritual language and their own language to identify themselves and count themselves a part of communities, and finding support in new and interesting ways. Some of them through chaplains who identify as humanists like myself, and some of them through people who may not necessarily identify as humanist chaplains but are trying to make their resources as accessible as they can be, or who work as interfaith chaplains like a lot of chaplains in hospitals do. So that's a bit about what we're going to talk about tonight, and now I'm going to let each of our really exciting panelists introduce themselves. And if you just say who you are and what the work you do is generally, and how you've kind of envisioned seeing this religious landscape in America change, and how you may be working with people in this increasing demographic. Fleet, do you want to start?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. And Walker, thank you very much for inviting us. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Fleet Mall, and I've been a Buddhist practitioner and a mindfulness practitioner for about 40 years, and I've been teaching mindfulness meditation, Buddhist meditation, for about 35 years. I'm a senior teacher and a minister in the Shambhala Buddhist community, an international Buddhist community, really with roots in Tibetan Buddhism, if you're familiar with that. And then I'm also a senior teacher and a priest, senior priest in the Zen Peacemaker Order, which is connected to the Soto Zen lineage of Japanese Zen Buddhism, and in particular is very connected, involved with the integration of social action, social justice, and Zen. And that's the reason why I ended up in 2 communities, because I was drawn to the second one for that reason. And probably an important thing to know about me in terms of this work is I spent 14 years in prison, and in federal prison on drug charges. I had already been pretty deeply trained as a Buddhist practitioner and teacher prior to that, which shows you what kind of knucklehead I was back then. But I had very much a split life. One of those people in the 60s that was always a spiritual seeker, but also caught up in the whole zeitgeist of the Cultural Revolution and Youth Revolution and drug, sex, and rock and roll and all the rest of it, radical politics of that era. And so before I could get all that untangled, I ended up in prison. And my son was 9 years old at the time, and I really hit a wall when that finally happened and realized that whole part of my life, which had been involved in making incredibly selfish decisions in terms of the impact I was having on others by being involved in the drugs and the risk I was putting my family at, my son. So I went through a real dark night of the soul with that experience and became radically dedicated to extricating any negativity from my life and trying to do something with the gifts I've been given by my family, by my religious training, my contemplative training, and my mentors and so forth. And so I was able to turn 14 years in prison really into my monastery and also a place of service. I happened to be sent to the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners, the maximum security hospital in the federal system, in 1985. And they had 1,000 prisoners, 400 psychiatric, 600 medical, and then about 300 inmates like myself to help run the place, working carpentry, food service, whatever. I had a master's degree, so I got a job teaching school. That was my day job for 14 years, was helping people get a GED or learn English or learn to read or study for college classes. In 1985, the AIDS epidemic was moving into full swing, and they were bringing all the AIDS patients there from around the federal system, especially from all the maximum security penitentiaries. And initially, they had them all locked up in the psychiatric ward, and there was a lot of fear around. Nobody had had any education on HIV and AIDS yet. There was a lot of fear within the inmate population. I got involved in concern about their plight and reached out to outside AIDS organizations. That connected me with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who became a lifelong friend and mentor until her death. Stephen and Andrea Levine, if you've heard of them. We just lost Stephen. He just died recently, the author of Who Dies and Healing into Life and Death. Really important figures in the conscious living and dying movement, along with Joan Halifax and others. And got connected with them, and then with another inmate, we started the first hospice program inside a prison, anywhere that we're aware of, in 1987. And we trained a group of prisoners, got outside people to come in and train us to become hospice caregivers. And that was a big part of my life for the remaining 11 years of my time there. Spent most of my meal breaks and my evenings and a lot of my weekend time up in the hospital caring for men who were dying. It was all male prison. And they were dying of AIDS as well as hepatitis C and other illnesses, heart disease, liver disease, and so forth. But AIDS was a big part of it. And so that was really, being involved in that work was one of the most transformative things I've ever been involved in my life, getting the attention off myself and my own issues and onto somebody else and their needs. Incredibly transformative impact. Unfortunately, I was grounded within a deep commitment to a contemplative life at that point. So I was also leading a meditation class for 14 years there, and a Buddhist meditation class, which was really pretty universalist and secular, because most of the people who came to it weren't necessarily that interested in Buddhism. A few were. They were interested in the practice of meditation. And many were still active in other religious traditions. So it was really about the practice of meditation primarily. And so while I was in, I ended up starting 2 national organizations. One was Prison Dharma Network to support Buddhist prisoners around the country interested in meditation and Buddhism. That grew into more of a contemplative network supporting anybody interested in any kind of contemplative spirituality in prisons, and the volunteers taking those kind of programs into prison. Today, that's morphed into Prison Mindfulness Institute, which is the International Association for Mindfulness-Based and Contemplative Prison Work. And we have 190 organizations. We're doing work all over the U.S. and around the country. And we not only work with prisoners, but we work with people in transition out of homelessness in prisons. And now we're also working with correctional officers and law enforcement, first responders, and so forth. And so a big part of my life is directing that organization today, Prison Mindfulness Institute. And I also served on the faculty at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado for 10 years. This is after I got out. And it's the first Buddhist-inspired university in the U.S. And as I started a center there called the Center for Contemplative End-of-Life Care and ran a professional training program and 6 national conferences over about 7-year period, training chaplains, social workers, physicians, and nurses in a contemplative approach to end-of-life care. I also on the faculty of a similar program at the Upaya Institute in Santa Fe, where I also co-founded a Buddhist chaplaincy program, which is in about its 8th year. And I teach down there every year. We're training Buddhist chaplains there. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, regardless of what kind of religious foundations chaplains have, they're trained to serve, meet people where they're at, regardless of what their faith is or their secular orientation, atheist, humanist orientation. As chaplains, we're training people just to meet human beings where they're at, with love and compassion and hopefully some insight and some empathic skills. So that's kind of the background on the work I do. You know, in terms of the topic here tonight, I found doing the hospice work in prison during those years, that was from like 1987 through 1999 when I was released, most of my patients were, I had maybe 2 people that kind of identified as Buddhist or at least were interested in Buddhism and meditation the whole time. I think I worked with about something around 45 patients in that program, and I was probably with about half of them at the moment they died. And only 2, I think, self-identified as Buddhists. I worked with a lot of Catholics because I'm bilingual, I speak Spanish, so I got a lot of the Latino patients. And, but the rest were Protestant or Jewish primarily, and a few Islamic patients, and mostly African American Islamic patients, and a few had some Native Americans, and so forth. But I found that work really didn't have very much to do with religion. Other than, you know, those who were interested in chapel services, I was always wheeling them down to the chapel in a wheelchair. And I spent a lot of time in Catholic Mass, which is the religion of my birth and of my family still, and I have a deep appreciation for it. So I'd go to the chapel a lot, but the work of chaplaincy and hospice care itself was really just about 2 human beings meeting and making a relationship, and the ability to recognize someone else's personhood, and the ability to let go of oneself enough to hold space for someone else and the work they needed to do at that point in their life, whatever that was. And in some cases, that had to do with reconnecting with their faith or continuing some aspect of their faith or some aspect of their religious practice. But for the most part, it really had to do with coming to terms with dying, and coming to terms with dying in prison in that situation. Largely, before going to prison and during and since I've been out, the work I do has been very much part of, in the Zen Peacemaker Order and the work at Naropa and other places, broadly a movement called socially engaged Buddhism or engaged Buddhism, which actually started in Asia as a reform of traditional Buddhism in many of those countries. Figures like Thich Nhat Hanh, who a lot of people have heard of, Sulak Shivaraksa in Thailand, the Dalai Lama, Dr. Ambedkar, the untouchable in India, responsible for mass conversion and the creator of the whole Ambedkar community, and A.T.R. Ratney in Sri Lanka. People bringing both Buddhism in those Asian countries, bringing back a focus on the needs of the poor and the disenfranchised, and also back to its contemplative roots, rather than just become more of a kind of a temple-based practice kind of thing. And in the West, it took hold in the 60s with environmentalists and people getting involved in Zen, people like Joanna Macy and Gary Snyder and so forth, and Robert Aitken Roshi. And the Buddhist Peace Fellowship came out of that eventually, the Zen Peacemaker Order, engaged Buddhism training programs at Naropa University and so forth. And that movement, the reason I bring all that up, is in the US, that movement it's still very much, engaged Buddhism is very much an alive movement, but it's also kind of naturally morphed into an engaged mindfulness movement, which is what we call the Institute. We're now training mindfulness teachers in to work with, it's a division of the Prison Mindfulness Institute, but we're training mindfulness teachers to work with at-risk individuals, underserved populations, vulnerable populations. And the reason that engaged Buddhism has kind of naturally morphed into engaged mindfulness is to bring the contemplative practices and the benefits that people discovered within their various Buddhist traditions and with their meditative practices into the mainstream, which is what engagement is all about. You're mostly bringing it out to a world that's not involved in Buddhist practice or necessarily even interested in Buddhism. So how do you bring the essence of this and the benefits of these contemplative practices and so forth to the world without the trappings of the religion, which maybe you have a deep love and abiding love for, but how do you bring out this essence? And so it's naturally the vast majority, even of people who call themselves doing engaged Buddhist work, if you looked at what they're really doing, it's really pretty secular and pretty much more like engaged mindfulness. So that seems like it's been a natural movement in this country, and as we all know, there's so many people that are non-identified now and not really joiners, which on the one hand is part of what's going on in culture. It's a sad thing, because personally I think our religious traditions offer a deeply rooted journey. All of our great religious traditions, and especially the contemplative parts, offer a deeply rooted journey. And you know, some of the secular stuff, it's great. The more of it, the better in our society. It's kind of a no-brainer. But hopefully that's a doorway for some people to go onto a more deeply rooted path. And that's pretty much going to take them into one of the religious traditions at this point, until maybe someday there will be some secular traditions that offer that depth of training and depth of retreat practice and a connection, you know, at that level. But at any rate, that's enough for me.
I'm Mary Martha Teal. I represent healthcare here on this panel tonight. I am what's called a clinical pastoral education supervisor, which means I'm a teacher of chaplains. And I've spent my career working in healthcare with a theme of working at end of life. So it's fun that we've got hospice over here, and I've done training at Upayat because of this theme of end of life in my own work. These days I work at Hebrew Senior Life, which is an 8-campus system of housing and healthcare for elders in the metropolitan Boston area. And the particular hospital that I work in is a residential hospital for people at the end of their lives. The average length of stay is about 2 years. So we get to know people well over time. And that's a particular joy. One of the reasons that I'm on the panel tonight is that I got a grant a couple years ago from the Louisville Institute to study how to offer and then to teach spiritual care to non-religious people. It's been an interest of mine all the way through my career for a variety of reasons, and especially being in an institution where most of our residents are Jewish, and the average age is 90, a significant percent of our residents would say, not me, I'm not religious. They may be very Jewish identified, but the belief aspect really is not there for many of our people. And I wanted to understand that better and then understand what spiritual care looked like, especially because I'm teaching students who come in to do it. And so I had the privilege of spending a year and a half or so working on this particular question in general terms, and then more specifically about American Jews and how they're a special case demographically of the non-religious in this country. I myself am United Church of Christ and grew up in that tradition, so I'm not Jewish. So that has been part of what's been so interesting to me in learning. One of the things that I love about chaplaincy is that it's in a liminal space. And so chaplains are always working between other entities. And liminal space is very creative space. And it's also space where spiritual things that can't happen in other space can happen. And so in the hospital, we're not medical and we're not really religious. We're right in the middle. And I love the creativity of that space. And it links with a lot of things in my own life. I won't go into all of that, but it's really been a theme in my life and in the work that I've done, and certainly now running a Jewish program as someone who's not Jewish. And the liminality, I think, is what allows me to feel very at home working with people who are non-religious. And we as chaplains do what sociologists call code switching. And a chaplain has to be able to code switch with every person that they work with, and to do that fluently without having to think deeply about it. So I always have in my head sort of a basic framework of what my task is, my job is, and that task list does not have the word God in it. It doesn't have the word faith in it. And my job is to find out what are the strengths and supports of this person, what are the sources of distress of this person, and then see how we can support the strengths and ameliorate to any degree that we can the sources of distress for this particular person. And so that model of how I understand what chaplains do with somebody who's religious or non-religious is really the same. And we just have to switch the language in which we work. And I love the creativity of that. And I love meeting people that I would never meet in my regular life, and so on. So I think that's enough for now, why I'm here, but it's work that I absolutely love.
Thank you, Martha. Yeah, Chris.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be back here at Tufts. It's been a little while. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm super excited about this topic and about this panel. Personally, I'm just really excited for the opportunity to learn from these wonderful panelists. I guess I'll just start by saying just a little bit about my background and how I got into the work that I do. I am currently the director of the Yale Humanist Community, which is a program that works to offer support, resources, and community for broadly defined non-religious students at Yale. I would say a significant majority of the students that currently come to our programs identify as atheists, agnostics, or sort of otherwise non-theistic, but we actually have a growing number of students who would consider themselves spiritual but not religious, or multi-religious, or non-traditionally religious, or who are just seeking a sort of third space or an alternate space, who are involved in our programs. So how I got into this work, I grew up non-religious, but was curious about religion in part because we never talked about it, and so I felt like it was this thing that was out there that I didn't really understand. My best friend in third grade was Jewish, and this was a really big part of her life, and I felt like she had access to something that I didn't. And so when I was around 11, I was invited to a Christian church by some friends. I converted, and in hindsight, looking back on that experience, I've identified, I think, the two primary factors that led to me converting. And the first is that about a year prior to converting, I started to read books like Roots and Hiroshima and The Diary of Anne Frank. So these were books that not only informed me of some of the greatest atrocities that have ever happened in human history, but they also told the stories of what it was like to experience those things in a way that filled me with a profound sense of injustice and a desire to understand how people could treat one another in those ways. So I had these questions, and I felt like I didn't have a space to unpack them. I didn't have a sort of language or a frame to even begin to approach them. And then the second factor was that my family life became disrupted when I was 11. My parents divorced, and that was a destabilizing act. And so I was looking for a sort of community or a space where I could find a sense of groundedness. And this church offered me both of those things. It also was a very theologically conservative church that had a bit of a sort of fixation on homosexuality. And I also realized around that same time that I was queer, and so that was not maybe the best community for me to land in at that moment in my life, but eventually I made my way into Christian churches where I could fully be myself and find acceptance for that, had incredibly positive experiences, and went to college, but when I finished high school, to study religion, thinking that perhaps I'd go into the ministry because I had had such positive experiences in high school with ministers who had helped me with these sort of big questions that I had and helped me navigate a lot of the sort of problems in my life. But I went to a Christian college, and when I was there, my Christian professors challenged me to really explore why I became a Christian in the first place. I think they could see that for me it was less about the belief and more about wanting to have access to these kinds of resources and to be in this kind of space. They didn't tell me that, they let me discover that for myself. And so eventually I realized I did not believe in Christianity. I realized I was an atheist, but as soon as I sort of left the church, I knew something was sort of not right, something was missing, and eventually I realized that what was missing was those resources in that community, that I still wanted those things, that was what had brought me back into what had brought me into Christianity in the first place, but I just couldn't reconcile myself to the beliefs. And so I continued to have this curiosity with religion, and eventually I went back to school to study religion, and I decided to go to a seminary because I wanted to study alongside people who were organizing these communities. And it was there that I sort of remembered why I became a Christian in the first place. And I decided I wanted to see what was available for people who aren't religious but still have these same human needs, the need to be in community with others, in a community that orients around these big questions of meaning and purpose, and to find care and support in times of need and in times of celebration. And so eventually I switched the focus of my degree from religious studies to pastoral care and counseling. And when I finished my program, I did some additional spiritual direction studies at Loyola University in Chicago, and then I took a position at the Humanist Chaplaincy at Harvard. I was there for 4 years doing pastoral care work with students at Harvard, and eventually when this new program at Yale was established, was persuaded to leave Harvard and to go to Yale. And so I've been living there for the last 2 years. I've been working with the program for the last 3 years. And we're a new program, we're growing, but it's very meaningful work. And part of what I have found so meaningful about what I'm working on there is that our organization actually has a sort of dual mission. We do serve the campus community, but we're also, our resources are open to the broader community. And we've developed some great working relationships with folks in New Haven, for example. We have a great partnership with the chaplain at the Connecticut Mental Health Center because she identified that there were a growing number of clients that she works with who are non-religious but still have these sort of existential questions, who are still looking for a kind of reflective partner. And though she is highly skilled at what she does and does a great job of code switching and of working with people who don't share her worldview, she found that some were explicitly asking for someone who wasn't religious. And so she reached out, and we've developed a really great partnership, and I've been able to work with some of the clients there as well. And I think that the thing that when we first started this conversation, Walker, you asked about sort of what are some changes you've observed, or how is the landscape shifting? And I think there have been a lot of shifts and a lot of changes, but one of the things that I've identified is that, or one of the things I've seen, I think more than anything, is that even though it's true that the number of people who say that they're not religious is growing, I think that even more so, there's a growing recognition among people who are not religious that they still want and need a lot of the same kinds of resources, and they have the same questions that everybody else does, and that that they want and deserve spaces and people who can help them navigate those questions. And so I think there's a growing recognition that that's important, and I hope that we'll see more and more people who are doing this work already and have been doing it for a long time and have a lot of wisdom to offer, meeting those folks where they are. And so I'm happy to hear what others on the panel have already said.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks. Hello, oh bags of mostly water. I'm quoting Star Trek and Alice Walker, because that's how the aliens see humans, right? As bags of mostly water. My name's Katrina Scott, and I'm actually the oncology chaplain at Mass General, and also ran with palliative care as their liaison. So my primary focus is accompanying oncology patients from first diagnosis to end-of-life care. And I've been in that position now for 10 years, and it's really been a wonderful place for me. As far as background goes, I went to Catholic girls' boarding school. I'm 64 years old, and so that's when nuns, you could never see their hair. And I kind of got away from organized religion and a belief in God when I was 13 and studying Greek gods, and I couldn't understand why Zeus impregnating a woman was a myth, and that Mary being impregnated was a truth and a belief. So I was stuck there. I went to undergraduate school at Simmons in philosophy and struggled a lot with clinical depression as a teenager after doing kind of like Fleet, a lot of drugs, and ended up my awakening, as I like to call it, came in 1980 when I read Matt Ridley's book, The Genome, and I found this unbelievable connection through the fact that plant DNA and my DNA is so close, right? We're all organic. And I fell in love with not logical positivism, but really science and just the way the world is and the natural, not the supra or the supernatural. And I was a documentary filmmaker, so I kind of made my own hours. I ended up working on a lot of big public works projects, like the cleanup of Boston Harbor. And when I turned 50, I decided I was a Steadicam operator. I sold my Steadicam and got into divinity school. And I thought, well, I'm at Harvard, you know, it's okay. I have a belief system. I don't believe in God, but I've got a belief system. And then I was outed. It was my second day of school was September 11th, 2001. Yeah. So here it is, you know, all this stuff done in religion, the name of religion, organized religion, and it just really reinforced on me that there's a space for people who don't identify with organized religion and actually see that as sometimes very bad. There's a place for us in the world. So I was outed my first semester by a Lutheran who couldn't believe I was in divinity school if I didn't believe in a personal God. And then I did a unit of clinical pastoral ed. Mary Martha was the director at Mass General. And I needed a religious affiliation, and that was quite hard because I didn't want to go the Unitarian Universalist route. And I found ethical culture, which is a humanistic religion. Without a belief, they actually don't take a stance on whether there's a God or not. They just don't think it's important. So it's a religion based on ethics. And I became their officiant, and I'm still their officiant, so I love to do weddings. That's my favorite thing to do. And I also do funerals, but I really like weddings. And as everyone has said here on the panel, it's really about accompanying people and journeying with them. I describe being a chaplain as a sponge. You hear these stories, you hold them in. In that respect, it's sacred space because you're asked to accompany people. My own personal religion is humanist, but I'm called an interfaith chaplain because I see people of all traditions. I really love it when I look on the census and I see an AG, which means agnostic, or an AT for atheist, because there is no HU for humanist, just those two categories. But generally, I would say 50% of our population at Mass General is Catholic. So I have that identity with them from my own Catholic roots, and half of those people are not affiliated anymore. They consider themselves as Catholics because that's just what they put down on the census. They felt betrayed by the Catholic Church over the sex abuse scandals and don't go to church anymore. So people have their own relationships, they have their own belief systems, and when I teach a lot of fellows and residents at Mass General on spiritual care of patients, and I always stress that they should be asking about belief systems, not about religion, because everyone has a belief system. And I just want to share with you now a definition of spirituality, which if I read it to you, it sounds like everybody has a spiritual side. And this is from the Consensus Project, which was a project in 2009 for palliative care. And then they did an international project, and the last sentence was added from the European cohort. Spirituality is the dynamic aspect of human life that relates to the way persons, individual and community, experience, express, and or seek meaning, purpose, and transcendence, and the way they connect to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, to the significant and or the sacred. Spirituality is expressed through beliefs, values, traditions, and practices. So, I mean, if you see this definition, it's not heavily coded with supernatural belief. It's really about meaning making. And I think that's what, whether you're a university chaplain or a hospice chaplain or a prison chaplain or a teacher of chaplains, it's really all about using the people that we work with, their own beliefs as measuring sticks, not ours. So I think that humanists have the ability to really step back and to see people and to understand that their beliefs aren't going to be the same as ours. Traditionally, most people aren't, but that we're accepting of it. I think the days of, even Sam Harris, right? He started off really hardcore, and now he's writing a book about, he wrote a book about his own spirituality. And I think people go through that. You might become a fundamentalist, or as you were, a faithist, but you know, it just, we're all in this together. And I think just if you can respect someone whose ideas might be quite different than your own, knowing what your own values are and holding true to your values, you can still provide solace and meaning, help people in meaning making, even though you're so totally different. Because we're all bags of mostly water.
Very good. Thank you, Katrina. Yes. Thank you very much, all of y'all. So like Katrina and Chris, I am a humanist and I'm a chaplain. I'm a humanist chaplain. But I think like all of us, many of the people who I work with wouldn't necessarily say that they're humanists. Even like Chris, also working in humanist chaplaincy in a university setting, many people I work with wouldn't necessarily use the humanist label or even identify as atheists or agnostics. Many people I see themselves, I think, from who I've spoken to, as sort of seeking or searching for a label, or maybe they just don't want a label at all, but they are searching for that deeper meaning that Fleet talked a bit about. And I think, and I also work with religious students, but many of the questions that people come to me for with one-on-one support are involved just about sort of families or your own emotional health or your spiritual health, however defined, or loss. And I wonder often, what is our role in supporting people outside traditional religion? You've all spoken about this to some degree, but I'd love to hear a little bit more. Is it just to be a listening presence? Is it to accompany them on a journey? And what does that journey kind of look like? And is there sort of unique guidance that we can offer the nuns? Is there unique guidance we can offer people who are increasingly not using religious labels? That it would be different from guidance we would give to religious people? Or, as some of you said, is it the same questions and we just use a different vocabulary to talk about them? That makes sense. Mary Martha, do you want to start?
Sure. I do think it's the same questions. And people are using different language. And as a chaplain, it's our job to use the other person's language. So when I thought about this question, I tried to think about for a non-religious person, what might be the symbolism of the chaplain. And there's certainly some negative aspects to that, and we as chaplains have to have a lot of humility about, we as people who come from religious traditions have to have a lot of humility about what religion has done in the world and why someone before us may have left a tradition. That being said, I think there's still an important role that we can play with people who are non-religious. And the images that I came up with were things like being a wise one, or being healthcare's heart, something like that. So for me, it's very much about the deeply human in the other person and the deeply human in me meeting. And so it's certainly about accompaniment. Chaplains generally don't give a lot of advice if they've had good training. And that's true whether somebody's religious in front of them or not religious in front of them. We do a lot of listening, and the time that we're apt to give advice is if someone is in distress because their belief system is not working for them. And then we might say to them something like, I am hearing your distress. Would you be interested in knowing how some other people make sense of the world in your situation? They may say yes or no, but they get to choose. If they say yes, then as a chaplain, you're going to sort of see where they are, and you're going to move just a little bit. You're not going to move a lot. You're going to move just a little bit and see how adjusting just a little bit works for that person. Is it enough? Is it too much? Whatever. And see what that does to their level of distress. We're really not in the business of giving advice. I do think that the human wisdom that we carry is useful because we've lived through a lot. And I thought it was interesting on the panel tonight how much people shared about their own individual stories. And that's the kind of human wisdom that informs who we are and what we do. And we may never share that with someone who comes to us, but we may be informed by that. We know what it feels like when a family's broken. We know what it feels like when a loved one is in prison. We know what it's like when a parent was a refugee. We know what it's like to be addicted. We know all these things that help to inform the empathy that we offer someone else. And I think often when someone feels really well understood, then we can encourage them to discern what they want to do. So that's a piece of advice I do give people. But it's not the kind of, this is what you should do. It's take these questions in our conversation and mull on them. And then please come back if you want to continue the conversation. So I want the wisdom to come from them, not from me.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll jump in with something. Maybe just kind of building on that a little. When I was doing hospice care in prison, I became really deeply interested in what spiritual care was, beyond any particular religious identifications or lack thereof. And again, as I said, my fellow prisoners, who were the men who were dying there, many didn't identify with a religion or had lost the faith of their childhood if they had it, and they felt pretty alienated from their family traditions, disenfranchised in many ways, and then some were still aligned with religious traditions. So it was all over the place. And so it was how do we really meet these people spiritually, these individuals? And so I was doing my doctorate at the time, and my first attempt to complete my dissertation. I'm now involved in my second attempt to complete my dissertation some 18 years later. But I was going to do it on spiritual care at the end of life, and I was looking, and as I studied things, I realized that in American hospice at that time, there was a real lack of understanding and a lack of funding for spiritual care. Hospice, as it came from the UK, in the UK, spiritual care was a big part of the hospice model, but spiritual care there was essentially Anglican religious care because they had a very homogenous religious culture there. When it came to this more pluralistic culture in the US, and people just kind of backed off from it. And so because there wasn't really any shared language for spiritual care beyond the definitions of various religious traditions, there wasn't research, there wasn't funding, and therefore it was always a struggle to have spiritual care and chaplaincy supported in hospice programs. I think that's shifted quite a bit, but at that time, that was the case. So I decided to look at all the nursing and medical and hospice and social work literature and see if out of that a language would emerge for spiritual care. And it was clear the definition you gave for spirituality was very much what emerged. It was that sense of how do we access a sense of and sustain a sense of meaning and purpose in our life, and the impact of when we lose that, and the spiritual distress that comes out of that, and then a sense of connectedness with ourselves, within ourselves, with others, and with some kind of transcendent or transpersonal dimension, whatever that might be for us, even if it's simply nature, something beyond ourselves, or a philosophy, or some principles, or whether it's a notion of God or something like that. And so some things that stood out for me along the way there. One, there was a definite, I love the term accompaniment for chaplaincy, and I found a statement in the nursing literature where a nurse used the term from the nautical term, coming alongside. That's when one vessel comes alongside another vessel and you actually tie up for a while and you just kind of go along together. You're actually cooked together. It's called coming alongside. And she talks about coming alongside another individual and being with them in that journey. So it's a journey of accompaniment. Also, I became connected with a music thanatologist in that time, Therese Schroeder-Shaker, and later involved her in a lot of conferences at Naropa University. And in her writings, I found a statement. She had a mentor who was some kind of chaplain or minister, who, as she was struggling with her work, at one point encouraged her, because she was how to work with people of other faith traditions than her own at that time. And she was going through all this inner translation and trying to figure out and he encouraged, or trying to just be so universal or so non-religious, you know, all the different ways we can try to not get in the way of someone else's faith or language. And he encouraged her at the time to be willing to at least experimentally just take her whole belief system and set it aside and take a deep dive into the belief system or context, religious or otherwise, of the other person. Just completely surrender to that. And have the confidence in one's own being and faith or whatever that you could set it on the side for a moment and take this deep dive and not get lost. Which actually, for a lot of us, that's a very challenging thing. And I found that was very helpful to me as I was doing hospice care. And some people would ask me to pray with them or pray for them. And my original instinct was I got to go run out and find a Protestant or find a Catholic or find somebody to come pray with them. I can't do that with them. And later I understood how I could and how I could hold space. Not by pretending to be something other than I was, but I could go into their space with them. And the last thing I'll say, this is something I think that could be helpful. It comes from the Zen peacemaker tradition, which has been broadly multi-faith and really focused on bearing witness work and multi-faith work. We go to Auschwitz every year. I developed a bearing witness retreat in Rwanda. We take people on the streets. A lot of focus on homelessness, but it's always been very focused on interfaith and multi-faith work. The founder of it, Bernie Glassman, who lives here in Massachusetts, has empowered Catholic nuns, Catholic priests, Jewish rabbis, Anglicans as Zen teachers and Zen roshis. So it's always been that focus. At any rate, the guiding principles of that tradition are called not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action or compassionate action. And the idea of not knowing is just to let go of fixed ideas about ourselves and others. And that's easier said than done, we all know. I think it's probably the goal of almost all the deep inner practices of how do you get into direct experiencing of the world without free of our conditioning, right? But to the extent that we can dissolve our conditioning somewhat, which takes practice, and then just the second is bear witness, just be willing to be with what is. Be in intimate contact with what is, whether we understand it, whether we like it, we don't like it, it's painful, it's joyful, whatever it is, just to bear witness and trust that that will connect us to some innate wisdom that's within ourselves, within the world, within the other person, within the relationship, and that out of that will naturally arise spontaneous actions which will be compassionate, loving, appropriate to the situation, and may not be the right actions 5 minutes later, because we continually have to come back to not knowing. So that practice has been one that's helped me enter into all the different kinds of work I do. And even if I get completely confused about who I am, who they are, what I'm doing, why I'm here, what's going on, and I feel challenged and somebody else's behavior is throwing me beyond my edges, I can always just remember, okay, take a breath, relax into not knowing, and just be here, and we'll see what happens.
Well, I'm just sitting here sort of taking in all that's already been said. I really appreciate the emphasis on accompaniment and the underscoring of not being advice givers. Fortunately, because there are many times when if that were my job, I would have nothing of value to offer. And I really appreciated what you've said about meeting people where they are and even the code switching piece, and that was something you were talking about as well, because this is something that I was confronted with when I was sort of preparing to do this work, when I was studying to do it, and I wasn't sure if it was something that I felt like I could do. And I was challenged on that in one of my spiritual direction courses at Loyola by a Catholic professor who really actually called me out in front of the class and said, "Chris, I know you're an atheist. Like, how are you feeling about this conversation that we're having," which was about, sitting with people who are Catholic and who are going through a sort of big challenge in life. And the professor said, "Chris, what would you do if someone came to you and said, my 13-year-old daughter has come to me and told me that she's pregnant, and I don't know what God wants me to do. What do you think God wants me to do? Or how, what does God want me to do?" And I sort of paused for a moment, and then, and basically his question was, how could you, he was almost sort of challenging me, how could you offer something to this person in this moment because you don't believe in God? And the response that I offered was that what I would say to this individual is not, certainly I wouldn't give advice, I wouldn't give an answer, for many reasons, especially at that point in my life. I was very, and still am, unqualified to advise on that specific situation. But what I could do is ask him if he could think of another moment in his life when he felt like he knew what God wanted him to do. What that felt like, how had he arrived at that place, to invite him to walk through a process of reflection where he could identify how he himself could find what he was looking for. And that's a way where I can accompany someone with something that is not aligned with my worldview, in a way where I'm still being authentic about who I am. And so, I agree. I think that anyone who's doing chaplaincy work or pastoral work should be able to meet someone where they are. However, there was something in your question, Walker, about what a sort of humanist doing this work could offer specifically to nuns. And one thing that I think I can offer, or one thing that I've found that's been helpful when appropriate and when I am able to sort of ask if this is something that would be helpful, is that I can offer personal stories, or I can kind of model someone who is not religious, who is thinking about these things, who has had a sort of experience of searching, maybe similar to what the person that I'm sitting with has had. And I find that often the students that I'm working with are looking for someone to show them that they're not alone in in the questions they're asking, in how they're feeling. And as someone who has gone from being religious to not being religious, that's something that I can offer in a way that is certainly not prescriptive, and that is not about trying to sort of guide that person in one direction or another, but rather to show them that that is a path that's available to them if they want. And this is something that I felt a very large need for, both when I was coming out as LGBT and wanted to see others who could sort of show me and live that out, and who I could identify with, and also as someone who's not religious and who came to that realization in a religious college where I felt like there was no one I could talk to who had had a similar kind of experience. And so that, I think, is something specifically as a non-religious person that I can offer to non-religious students. But certainly, everyone who's doing this work, whether they're doing it from a religious orientation or a secular orientation, can offer specific things from their own worldview, and they can still also accompany someone who doesn't share that worldview.
Yeah, I use, Brian Swim's cosmology story of we are, and also Carl Sagan, we're all stardust. I mean, isn't it miraculous that like 4.5 billion years ago, some little RNA was against a little vent, a big vent maybe underwater, and here we are. That's kind of amazing. So for me, that's enough. And for me, that's just awe-inspiring, or as Ed Wilson, would say, the Ionian enchantment. And I would try to find out from someone where they find that awe, that love. It's really interesting. Here in the Northeast, when we do studies about spirituality and oncology or cancer, we ask about belief in God. And in a study for ovarian cancer folks in Florida, 50% of the cohort were Jewish women, and their spiritual resource that they named was their family. You know, your family's a big resource, a spiritual resource for you. And it's not necessarily your birth family. It's the family that you choose to be with. It's your own community. The end.
I've definitely heard that as well. People finding their families. As you come to, especially a growing number of students coming to Tufts from just somewhere other than even Massachusetts or coming internationally, finding a lot of support among just the people they're close to and finding their chosen family here. That's such a big part of students' lives here, I think, as well. It was a part of my life as well when I was a student here. Another question that I have, and I definitely want to leave time for anyone who's interested here to share their own perspectives or ask any questions that y'all have. But another question that I asked, we did a similar event like this that was specifically among humanist chaplains and people working in chaplains who identify as humanists last year, and it has to do with how we make chaplaincy services, I guess, accessible, and how we think about this changing landscape in terms of what are like services that are offered. So essentially, I think, you know, humanists and atheists and agnostics are looking for chaplaincy services more and more, and that's becoming easier as, you know, chaplaincies like mine and Chris's are established in universities like these, but these are really elite institutions, and many other religious minorities in America are still struggling to find those services, and still struggling to find that representation inside chaplaincies. And I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on how we make sure everyone from atheists to Sikhs to Christians, is how to make sure everyone is getting the resources that they need from chaplaincies, and how we can, what we can do in our own work or even politically in our institutions to make sure that that's possible. Yeah, Katrina.
I think the first step is to dump the word chaplain seriously and to use spiritual care specialist or spiritual care provider or caregiver. Yeah, I mean, that's what you are. Chaplain is so laden with Christian, you know, it's laden with that. You can't get away from that world. In Canada, no one uses that word. They're spiritual.
So what were you suggesting as the alternative?
Spiritual care.
Spiritual care.
Spiritual care providers or spiritual caretakers. People don't. I did an interview, Women on the Street interview, about maybe 8 years ago, and asked 50 people if they knew what a chaplain was, and 2 people knew. And I don't think it's changed. Seriously.
Yeah, I don't use the word chaplain. Yeah. I mean, I did when I was at Harvard, but I don't at Yale. And some of it's context specific, but I also find that so many of the students that I work with have never heard of the word chaplain before.
It's a chaplaincy fear factor, especially if you're really sick in a hospital and you say, I'm the chaplain, you walk into a room and they're like, am I that sick?
Huh.
So I agree with what's been said. As somebody who teaches chaplains, I think this is a huge challenge and a huge question. And in a way, I think the answer is there's no way to guarantee that everybody's going to have access to their particular representative, especially if we hold a standard for the quality of care that that person is going to offer. And as a professional chaplain and as a teacher, I care a lot about the quality of spiritual care that's offered someone. So I'm not going to just use the phone book and call somebody, because I don't know what I'm going to get. I don't know what that patient's going to get, or that student's going to get when we do that. And so for me, the issue of getting really good training is important, and it means that the professional chaplaincy organizations need to continue opening up and up and up and up and up to greater diversity of who's being trained. And there are definitely traditions in this country that have just huge needs for chaplains. Islam is certainly one of them. I mean, wow, if you're a Muslim who's done 4 units of CPE, you can get a job anywhere you want. I mean, there is just such a burning need. And so I don't think we can guarantee it, but I want that quality built into the question too, because I'd rather have somebody, not a perfect match, give better quality care than have the match look right on paper, but somebody be damaged by the care. So
yeah, I'm so glad you said that, actually, because that's something that I have felt similarly concerned about, because I think as there's been this growing recognition that there's a need to provide these kinds of resources and care to non-religious people, some institutions have basically done what you've described. They've gone to the phone book, looked for someone local who says they're a humanist, and there's no sort of process to ensure that there's been training. But that being said, I do think that, as you say, anyone who is well-trained should be able to accompany anyone of any belief. On the other hand, no one person can contain all of the information about every tradition in the world, and so you should have people who you know that you can reach out to who can either give you more information to help with someone that you're working with. For example, I've worked with students of a minority faith perspective that I didn't know that much about, and so I turned to professional colleagues who could give me more information, as well as, if that's a person that you trust to do good work, to be able to actually facilitate a relationship and help bring that person into the work that you're doing. But likewise, I'm always heartened when there is the ability to bring in well-trained people and to make more sort of worldview, to have greater worldview representation. If you look at the humanist chaplaincy at Harvard, for example, when the first humanist chaplain there, Tom Farrick, started, there was a much smaller number of chaplains at Harvard, and they were largely Christian. And he believed very strongly that that should expand. And now Harvard has, I think, almost 40, including a Zoroastrian chaplain, a Swedenborgian chaplain. And when I was there, there was no one to work specifically with the Sikh student community, and there were Sikh students who were asking for that. And so even though my job was to work with the humanist students, I worked with those students to try to help them connect with people who could help make that happen, because I think that that is important. If there are a number of different worldviews represented in the resources available to students, for example, because I work in the university setting, then we should make every effort that we can to expand it to ensure that all students feel that they have someone who is there to work with them specifically. But at the end of the day, and this is something that I think is essential to doing this work, whether we call it chaplaincy or pastoral work or whatever, is that you should be able to provide quality care to someone, even if their worldview is radically different from yours. But the challenge, I think, is that there will be people, and I find this to be true, I think, especially among non-religious folks, who are sort of suspicious or who don't trust that you will actually be able to accompany them if that you are a religious person. And that can be a barrier or a hurdle. And I'm not saying that it's a fair assessment, but it's a reality that I think we have to learn to address.
I'd like to frame the question maybe just a little differently. I think, I'd be curious if my panelists agree with this, but it's a generalization, but in general, early in life, adolescence, young adulthood, people are struggling with the existential questions of life. And then at the end of life, people are often revisiting those questions. And in between, people are basically just trying to lead their lives. And so I think a lot of the support people need in the middle of their lives is just how to get their needs met, their relational needs, livelihood needs, meeting the basic needs of life, and dealing with the challenges of relationship and family and what have you. Although I think more and more there are people waking up in the midst of their lives at different eras in their life, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and looking for something more, because in so many ways our culture has become so materialistic and so shallow in some ways that people are, in the contrast to that, people are having these awakenings and looking for something. So on the one hand, I completely agree that, especially with the very, increasingly large immigrant populations in our country, that we have to be able to bring people the support of people of their faith, or at least have that information. And then there's, there's the kind of already Americanized people and longtime American people who become very secular, and the whole middle class and that whole world. But I think because somebody, a social worker can meet a lot of those middle of life's needs, a counselor, any kind of mentor. But what about a spiritual care provider or a chaplain? Why are they needed there? And what if we're in a situation where someone is coming to us and what they're looking for is not just some support through a difficult time, but they're really looking for their doorway into a spiritual journey of some kind. And do we have the ability to, and what I think there's two things to that. It can in a and certainly not in any kind of having an agenda towards our particular tradition, but can we support them in finding that pathway that they're looking for, some deeper context for their life. And then I also think what people are looking for is some depth of being from the person they are with, who's supporting them. So that brings me to the question of spiritual formation for chaplains. And that's understood differently in different traditions, but I think we could very much see chaplaincy, especially in a secular sense, it could become not that different from social work school in many cases. And I think that would be a real loss. And up till now, it's many of the religious traditions that offer the context for deep spiritual formation, whether it's the context of deep retreat work, contemplative inner work, or whether it's deep study, or whatever it is, deep community work, but offer that. And so as we're developing secular traditions, the whole emerging mindfulness movement, how do we create that opportunity for people maybe who are coming from a more humanist or secular perspective and wanting to do this work, the opportunity for spiritual formation, so that then when they're accompanying somebody, that there's some real depth there, that they've done their work, that they've asked the tough questions and gone into those places of not knowing, and maybe that dark night of the soul experience, and there's some real depth of formation there.
I'd just like to say one thing about the nuns. Now there are over 30% of people under the age of 30. What will happen when they get older? Will they join a brick and mortar congregation, or will they still stay with Facebook for their community building? And if they don't, they're going to look for spiritual care and support when they're sick, and someone in the hospital is going to have to provide that for them, the family or in that hospital situation, because they don't have any clergy, they don't have any spiritual leaders per se. So I think we're gearing up in the hospital trying to do a lot of work with clinicians outside of the chaplaincy spiritual care practice to talk to them about how to handle questions when people seem in spiritual distress at 2 o'clock in the morning, how to handle that, because they're gonna be getting those questions, I think, more and more and more. So that's just my own thought.
It's very interesting. I understand it also among nursing staff in hospitals. In many cases, there are a growing number of non-religious nurses, and I imagine that's true in some ways in prisons as well. I mean, the chaplaincy isn't just for the clients among who we think of as the population of that, going patients in that setting, but people working in that setting as well.
I think, and Fleet can talk about this, for hospital situations, patients come and go, the staff stay. So the staff kind of become your congregation.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. I do want to leave time for people in the audience who have given us your time as well to ask any questions that y'all have before we wrap up. So we have about 15 minutes. So does anyone have any questions for the panelists up here? Yeah.
Chris, I was wondering, besides one-on-one pastoral sort of work, do you also have groups or meetings?
Yeah, actually, and it's interesting because I think when I first started doing this work, I assumed that I would, and I think some of that was because I did so much spiritual direction coursework, but I assumed so much of what I was going to be doing was one-on-one, but actually some of the richest stuff is what happens in our discussion groups. We have a member of our community who decided that he is a secular Jesus follower, that he doesn't believe in the divinity of Jesus, but he wants to use Jesus as a sort of roadmap or as an example of how he wants to live his life. And he and I were talking about this, and I said, I think that this idea of following someone could be really interesting for our community to explore, but what if we expanded it beyond Jesus and started a discussion group around this idea of following? Because we live in a world where, and especially at Yale, there's this, everyone wants to be a leader, right? And there's this idea that leadership is this thing that we're supposed to aspire to, but what's it mean to follow someone? Can you follow without losing yourself in the process? Can you follow in a way that's critical? And what does following do for you? And so that's one of our discussion groups. We have 4 discussion groups that meet, each meets once a month, and those are spaces where people are exploring, that is just one of the focuses, but where they explore together those kinds of things. And similarly, we have Sunday gatherings where there's a someone will offer a talk, but then we have something afterwards called the moment of connection, where there's a prompt from the community to turn to people near you and discuss the content of what you heard and how it sort of relates to your personal experience. And so there's some sort of group work that happens in that way as well. And we try to intentionally build that in. Yeah?
And I just was wondering, when people come to your discussion group or your event, and they kind of say, oh, this is what I was looking for, and they keep coming back, well, how are they different than the people who go to a discussion group or an event and say, wow, this was not what I expected? How do you describe who kind of fits what you're doing versus who doesn't?
That's an interesting question, because I get to have the conversation with the person who said, this was a really great fit and I'm really excited about this, much more than I get to have the conversation with the other person. So it's hard. I have more information about group A than I do about group B. And in some ways, I think, that makes it hard to actually try to sort of improve our programs, because, we're sort of reinforced by the people who come find what they're looking for, and we sort of miss the folks who maybe are, not feeling met by, or like they're getting what they're looking for out of what we're wanting. But I think that it's somewhat simple, and I think it echoes a lot of what has already been said on this panel, which is that there are people who aren't religious, or who, don't consider themselves even to be a spiritual person, even with this very inclusive definition of spirituality. We have weekly student dinners, and one of the dinners that we had a conversation about spirituality, and half of our students said they really resonate with that language, and half said, I'm not a spiritual person, and that language doesn't work for me. But across the board, the folks, certainly at least the ones who continue to come back, are people who have the same needs that we all have, which is a need to be seen, to be heard, to be challenged, to be held accountable to the things that we say are important to us, and to connect with others in a space that is, I have, once in a while, I'll have someone ask me, how is what you guys are doing different from, the social needs that can be met through a knitting group or a soccer team or that sort of thing? And I think it's sort of a silly question in a few ways, but I think the sort of biggest difference is that those things do meet a lot of our social needs, but they're not grounded, and they don't orient around these big questions of meaning and purpose. They're not a meaning-making exercise, though meaning can certainly be found in them, and they can be a space where those conversations can happen. They don't happen in this sort of intentional way, and I think that that's what people who come to us and continue to come back are finding there.
Great. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask the university chaplains, and maybe some of the others of you, to comment on the extent to which the existential crisis over the environment plays a role in your chaplaincy. Because I know I sat every day for 4 months with the MIT students at their winding. And that was a lot of the words that we've been using here about seeing and hearing and being present while they make the decisions about what they want to do. It really resonated with me, what you said, and I'm wondering, have you had a similar?
I actually don't think this needs to be just for the university folks. I imagine, even based on some of what you were saying about some of your life's work, that you might have some comments on that. Not to put you on the spot.
I don't know, I was an STS student. I don't know, I think there's so much waste in hospitals. You are not allowed to recycle drugs that you might have. Even in the hospice situation, most of the time they come into your home and they'll flush stuff down the toilet, and you're like, why can't you use this? Sutures that we throw away if they're a year old that could go somewhere else. There are some groups that are doing that, but it's very few and far between. It's really disheartening where I am anyway in the hospital.
And do you find people are really in existential distress over?
No, they're really worried about their own physical health. Most of my patients, they're worried about the fact that their chemotherapy drug is $150,000 when it cost $20 to make it. I'm sorry, that's my pet peeve.
And I would say in my healthcare setting that It doesn't come up a lot in terms of the resident care work. I mean, I'm involved as a human being because I see connections between all these things. So that's work that I do on my own time and as part of my own congregation and so on. But it's not about the 90-year-olds with dementia who are with us for years. That's not their primary existential concern. But I see the connections.
When I was on faculty at Neuropa for 10 years, working with primarily undergraduates, I would say environmental issues were their main concern. And I think that's expanded now. I think it's still environmental issues, and I think it's mixed with the social issues around racism and anti-racism work and the LGBT community and the Black Lives Matter movement and these kind of things. And I find young people in university are that these are big, huge questions for them of, the sustainability of human life on this planet and the environmental side and the social sustainability of our life in this particular culture where we're still in denial about so many, really undermining strains within our culture that we have not dealt with that are really eroding human capital and community cohesiveness and all the people that are falling through the cracks in our society and to the levels. And young people are very, very attuned to that, I find.
Yeah. And I would echo that as well, Fleet. And I think one thing I would say is that it's not necessarily students I speak with feeling the particular explicit pressure of climate change or the environment, but it would be students feeling their own identities threatened in a lot of different ways, some of which intersect with climate change and stuff, especially students coming internationally from like the global south that's disproportionately affected by climate change, or students who feel economic pressure that is related to the economics of the environment, the economics of oil, things like that. But I mean, I would say in general that being involved in social movements, being involved in pressing social issues and seeing these social issues come to the fore, especially, I won't talk much about the election, this is not the time, but I would say that as the 4-year cycle, things are made very, very explicit, especially today. I think people feel feel very particular pressures and see their lives threatened in unique ways, and that creates existential distress. And to see people around them not take that seriously, I think creates a unique distress among a lot of people, especially young people. And I definitely think that that's a unique thing that the Tufts University Chaplaincy has taken on in the last few years is hearing those voices and trying to engage with not just understanding chaplaincy in terms of people's explicit religious faith-based needs, but understand how these needs are existential. These needs are about people's lives and experiences, and they're very and they're human experiences, and they're very deep human experiences that we have to take seriously. We have time for, I think, 1 or 2 more questions. Let's go, okay, we can go quickly. All right, yeah. Let's go down the line here. Yeah.
Fleet, you brought up racism and Black Lives Matter, and I'm wondering how race plays a role in your work, especially like being a student of color and seeing, obviously, all of you are all seeming to be white, how that works out, and Fleet in particular, I'm not surprised, but how it works out for you in working with mindfulness and Japanese work and being Japanese yourself, and just for any of you like relating to your clients and that.
I'd like to give a shout out to one of my colleagues, Rhonda McGee, and encourage you to check out her work. Rhonda McGee is an African-American law professor at the University of San Francisco Law School. And she's also an MBSR teacher and a leader in the mindfulness movement. And she's done a lot of writing around in terms of anti-racism work and so forth. And she's doing a lot of work around this idea of color insight. It's counterposed to the idea of some notion of color blindness, or eventually we'll have a colorblind society. But she's talking, and this is in line with ideas like cultural humility and so forth. But I think she has some real brilliance in areas of diversity and inclusion and anti-racism work from a mindfulness perspective. So I would just encourage you to check out her work, Rhonda McGee.
I would say in healthcare we've got a huge problem in that the healthcare professionals are quite stratified in terms of race in our institutions in just hideously painful ways. And one of the ways that chaplains often respond is by making sure that there's a chaplain who is assigned to work with staff, for example, gives special support to staff, so it's not just patient care. In terms of my teaching, I make sure that there's a component in every course that I do about racism, and in any of the specialties that I'm teaching, that we look at that specialty through the lens of race as well. So I think healthcare has a huge challenge, and I think that even in terms of chaplains themselves, there's a dearth of chaplains of color who are certified in this country, and part of that has to do with the economics of undergraduate education, graduate education, plus additional clinical education to become a chaplain. And that's a problem, because we want our chaplaincies to be representative of our constituencies.
Yeah. Yeah, I would probably not add a whole lot to that, besides to say that certainly many of you may be aware that at Yale this year there have been a lot of conversations around race at Yale, and a lot of the students that I work with were very actively involved in those conversations and continue to be. And in working with those students, first of all, I tried to do as much listening as I could, and asking how I could be helpful. But I think that one thing that I try to do, in addition to acknowledging my own limitations in a lot of these conversations, is to bring in, and this I think goes back to something that I was saying earlier, to bring in people for programs and to facilitate conversations who have more expertise, who can offer more than I can, and that's been a big priority for us this year, and it actually was, even before a number of the conversations emerged, it was, we laid out all of our programs for the year, and that was a big part of what we've been trying to address this year. And I think that's something that that we need to be proactive about rather than reactive, rather than coming up against our own limitations in these conversations. We actually need to make a very intentional effort to expand the sort of resources that we are able to help offer to folks beyond what, because for myself, I can only speak from my own particular experience and background, and so recognizing that I have limitations there, I try to bring in others who can help with that. And that's true in a lot of different ways. Beyond race, it's true in terms of gender and gender identity. It's true in terms of just sort of educational background. For example, I work with students who go to Yale, and I previously worked with students who went to Harvard. Their academic experience was very different from the academic experience. I had a small liberal arts college in the Midwest, and so there were things that I could offer them that were another perspective outside of that, but there were also things about their experience that I had to work really hard to understand. And so I think no matter what, when you're working with a student, in my case, you need to work very hard to try to understand where they're coming from and try to help connect them with resources when there are things that you come up against that are beyond what you can offer. And having a kind of humility about that, I think, is essential.
I know this is true for me, and it might be true for many of the people here in this room, where I identify as non-religious. My family is very much religious, and that hasn't really been a conflict, but it is at times very hard to understand their spiritual background, but also like what motivates their actions and what motivates their thinking. And I was hoping you might be able to just talk about what are ways that would make it easier to connect and understand. It doesn't often really matter in the day-to-day, but there are big events that happen where I think it would be very valuable to understand their perspective or their family.
I could offer one thing. My family are still very deeply Catholic, which is the religion of my upbringing. But also more than that, I think, as several people on the panel have mentioned, several of my colleagues have mentioned, that we're talking about human beings meeting their needs, right? And, you know, actually having a broad understanding of what that means can be really helpful. Because even in my view, at least, even when human beings commit the most heinous acts that we know of, and we know human beings are capable of doing some pretty heinous things, they're still basically trying to get their needs met. Their need to be safe, secure, happy, to belong, to be connected to something, whatever, to survive. And often, you know, in some cases doing so in some pretty twisted ways because of the conditioning and of their experiences, and really twisted up their psychology and their thinking and so forth. But still having that understanding gives us a different perspective on how we view people who are acting in ways that we might perceive as being an enemy or a threat to us. So that's in the extreme. I mean, I think we can get in relationship with people who are really even, you know, doing some horrible stuff. Much even more so the people we just disagree with politically, or the people we disagree with religiously, or then we come back to our own family members. And, you know, we all share the same needs for belonging, autonomy, connection, love, respect, meaning and purpose, all these basic human needs. And some of us get those needs met in a religious context, some in a spiritual context, some in a secular context. We get them met through relationship, through work, through nature, in all kinds of ways. So I think if we have that context, for example, with my family, that I understand there's a certain set of their basic human needs that are still being met for them quite nicely by their participation in that congregation and in that faith context. And when I see it that way, I don't really struggle with it anymore. And I also feel in alignment that I'm getting a very similar set of needs met in lots of different ways, some of which they and others wouldn't align with in the way that I do, right? I don't know if that's helpful, but.
One of the things that I would say is use open-ended questions with your folks. So when there is an event that you're curious about, why they're doing something in the way they are, you might say that, Mom, I'm curious how you understand that particular action, or how you chose to do this particular thing. What was behind that? I would like to understand better. And I'll tell you, as a parent, parents are real suckers for adult children, like actually wanting to know who they are. And that's apt to lead to a more interesting conversation than you might imagine if you can, have the courage to actually be curious about what's motivating them. So let go of the judgment and bring the curiosity. Ask an open-ended question, and something cool will happen. I don't know what, but something cool will happen.
Let's give a hand both to yourselves and to the panelists for being a part of this tonight. Thank you all very much. Thank you all for those really exciting and important questions that you asked, and for you all for being a part of this. We're over time, and I want to be respectful of your time, but I will just say that if you're interested in being more involved in the Tufts Humanist program or in the University Chaplaincy at all, you can talk to me, or you can talk to Greg or Lynn or Zach back there, who are also chaplaincy staff. The next humanist thing coming up is we're a part of the Walk for Hunger, which is the annual 20-mile walk around Boston. You raise money for his organization, Project Bread, which I think is a really extraordinary organization doing hunger work locally and nationally. And if you want to be a part of that, we have a walk team we're building. It's on May 1st, the morning of spring fling, not spring fling time. So if you, I didn't pick the date. And so if you'd like to be a part of that, please let me know. And otherwise, I'd love to hear from all y'all again. And thank you again for being a part of this. And I look forward to talking to you more. So thank you very much.
Thank you.